Hello, welcome to the workshop on curiosity training, the importance of external mindfulness in CBT for social anxiety. I'm Larry Cohen. I'm the co-chair as well as co-founder of the National Social Anxiety Center. And I live in Washington, D.C., where for just over 30 years, I've been directing a CBT clinic specifically for social anxiety and related problems called Social Anxiety Help. And I'm certified in CBT by the Academy of Cognitive and Behavioral Therapies. The National Social Anxiety Center, which I represent, is an organization made up at this point of 21 regional clinics around the United States, which all specialize in providing evidence-based services for people with social anxiety, as well as educating the general public and the clinical community about the best treatments for social anxiety disorder. If you're interested in pursuing the status of regional clinic, affiliating with the National Social Anxiety Center, or for using some of our services. For example, we have a Facebook page for consumers. We have a blog that comes out every month for several years now, again for consumers with information about social anxiety. And we have a number of resources specifically for clinicians, training seminars, such as this one will be posted there, as well as others that already are, as well as research summaries, interviews with researchers, and a monthly peer consultation forum to discuss social anxiety cases. All the links are here that you may want to pursue. This slide shows a number of really useful resources for therapists who want to learn more about the best treatment approaches for social anxiety. Most of today's seminar will be using the first resource, which is through David Clark. There's multiple David Clarks in the CBT world. The one I'm speaking about today, David M. Clark, is British in Oxford University in England. And he has a number of video trainings for therapists that are absolutely excellent, that include the materials that I will be discussing today. There's a number of other manuals that are available in CBT for social anxiety that are all useful. They each have a somewhat different approach, but they're all very overlapping and very useful and all evidence-based. And finally, the last resource listed on this slide is a video recording of a 3-hour training workshop I did at the last ADAA conference that was held in Chicago, in which I integrate all these different CBT approaches for social anxiety, and you may find that useful as well. This slide has all sorts of resources that are targeting consumers with social anxiety. A number of self-help books, YouTube videos that are good for attention training that we'll be discussing today, organizations where they can get more educational information as well as online support, just a variety of things that your clients may find useful. One thing that I want to emphasize that I think is so important, and frankly, I think is little understood in regards to social anxiety, is that it's not just an anxiety disorder, although that's how it's classified in the DSM. Social anxiety disorder is also about shame as well as anxiety. The two key elements of social anxiety disorder are anxiety and shame. The core fear of social anxiety is the fear of judgment, or things like judgment, such as embarrassment, criticism, rejection, being scrutinized by others. And this fear of judgment, of course, leads to the experience of anxiety. Now, it's important to recognize that social anxiety per se, as opposed to social anxiety disorder, is normal, in fact, is positive. If we did not experience any fear of judgment, then society, and for that matter, personal relationships, could not function. We need to have some sensitivity to other people's feelings and reactions toward us in order to have successful, healthy relationships, and for that matter, in order for society to function. In fact, there's an evolutionary theory of social anxiety that people evolved with the capacity to experience social anxiety so that they wouldn't be expelled from the tribe, from the band, from the society, because people could not live alone. They would simply die if they were expelled. And so we need a certain level of sensitivity to the concerns of others about us, or society, and for that matter, personal relationships could not function. And Lord knows there are people who have too little social anxiety. Depending on the symptoms, we might call them severe narcissists, where everything is really about them, or psychopaths, people with antisocial personality disorder, who have no regard for the feelings and concerns of others. So we need a little social anxiety. But social anxiety disorder, which generally in this presentation I'll just refer to as social anxiety, but I really mean social anxiety disorder, is when the fear of judgment or scrutiny or embarrassment, rejection is so severe that it is debilitating. It prevents us from pursuing major life goals, or it makes it really, really hard for people to pursue those goals. That's what's meant by social anxiety disorder. But in addition to anxiety, social anxiety is about shame. Shame is based on core beliefs of personal deficiencies, a sense that we are in some fundamental way not good enough to be accepted by others, not as good as other people are. And it is based on an underlying perception that, an underlying assumption of perfectionism, that people are judging us on an all or nothing standard. And if we don't meet that high standard perfectly, then we are viewed by others as not good enough and are likely to be judged and rejected and shamed. Social anxiety disorder used to be called, in older versions of the DSM, social phobia. It's still called that by the ICD. That's unfortunate because although social anxiety disorder is indeed a phobia, an exaggerated and debilitating fear, in other words, social anxiety also is a shame-based disorder as well. I do need to add that it is theoretically possible for someone with social anxiety disorder to not have any shame-based core beliefs and to simply be phobic about a particular type of interaction, most commonly public speaking. And in fact, in older versions of the DSM, there was a subcategory of social anxiety for people like that, but they've eliminated that because it's actually very rare. Most people with social anxiety, their social anxiety is generalized, and it's generalized into many different situations in their lives, not just one phobic trigger. And the generalization is because of shame-based core beliefs of deficiency involving perfectionistic standards. There are many different triggers for social anxiety, far more than perhaps you realize. First of all, the term social in social anxiety isn't just about socializing in the usual sense. Although many people, maybe most, I'm not sure, with social anxiety disorder are socially anxious in social settings, such as mingling, parties, talking to strangers, dating, etc. Much of social anxiety is also in performance settings, such as public speaking, or speaking up at meetings, such as at work, or being interviewed, taking tests, being a stage performer. Sexual anxiety is a type of social anxiety. Again, although it's classed separately in the DSM, but it's based on the fear of judgment, embarrassment, rejection. That's social anxiety. And sports-related anxiety as well. Social anxiety could also be based on the fear of being observed. So for example, shy bladder syndrome, clinically called periuresis, is a type of social anxiety because it's generally based on the fear of being embarrassed if being observed while having difficulty urinating in a public bathroom. It could also be social anxiety in various public places where there are strangers around, but we're not actually interacting with the strangers. For example, it might be crowded stores or shopping malls, bustling sidewalks, using public transportation. People with social anxiety may experience much self-consciousness and a sense of being observed and thought of as acting weird. Finally, and in some ways most importantly, because it cuts across all of the above, much of social anxiety typically, not with everyone, but with most people, is based on the fear that their anxiety itself will be manifest and will be seen, will be observed by others. It might be physical anxiety symptoms such as blushing, sweating, having cold hands, your voice, your hands quivering, or your mind going blank, or your performance being messed up by your anxiety. And so many people with social anxiety are socially anxious that their social anxiety will show, which of course fuels a vicious cycle and makes them feel more socially anxious. There are important diversity factors that are relevant to social anxiety. For example, people who are of racial minorities, African American, Hispanic, Asian American, people who are lesbian, gay, bi, or transgender, women, people of different cultures, different countries, who native language is different than the one they're speaking in public or with others. It could also be based on things that aren't usually considered demographic, such as how attractive they believe that they are physically, or how attractive society tends to view them, how attractive their personality is, whether or not they have a disability. And specifically, people on the autism spectrum often, especially in adulthood, when they're more aware of how others are reacting to them, often have social anxiety. So social anxiety is not based on the false fear of judgment. It's based on the fear of judgment, but judgment does happen. It's not just in their heads. Judgment happens sometimes for demographic reasons, sometimes for other reasons. The problem with social anxiety is not that we're making up judgment, but that we are magnifying it. We imagine it to be much more common, much more severe, much more important than it really is. And we're also minimizing our ability to handle it. And we'll be addressing how to deal with both. There's a number of facts about social anxiety disorder that are listed here and in the next slide. I'll just mention some of these. One is that it's much more prevalent than most people realize. Lifetime in adulthood, 12% of people in the US anyways have experienced social anxiety disorder, about 9% of adolescents. About a third of all people in the US anyways have a profound fear of public speaking, but that doesn't mean a third of all people have social anxiety disorder, because many of those people never really have to confront public speaking in their lives, and therefore the fear of public speaking isn't debilitating for them in their lives, and so it's not considered social anxiety disorder, but it is that common. In fact, there's a great joke by Seinfeld that I sometimes use with clients. My delivery is not as good as his, but bear with me. And it says that according to surveys, that the fear of public speaking is the most prevalent, the most common fear among Americans, even higher than the fear of death. And so he says, so it must be that most people would rather be lying in the casket at a funeral rather than standing up and delivering the eulogy. Social anxiety is, depending on the survey, the third or fourth most prevalent of all mental health disorders, as well as the first or second most prevalent of anxiety disorders, depending on the survey. Most people with social anxiety, about 2/3 of them, have at least one other mental health disorder. Most commonly, it's depression or another anxiety disorder, sometimes specifically suicidality, alcohol use or other substance use disorders. And the more severe form of social anxiety disorder is avoidant personality disorder. And some folks with social anxiety have that problem as well. It's really a continuum, and in the footnotes of the DSM, they acknowledge that. Many clinicians think, okay, social anxiety is very prevalent, but it's actually a minor thing. It's just being shy. Actually not. Less than a third of people with social anxiety disorder have it in a very mild form. More than 2/3 have it in a moderate to severe form. And what does that mean? What's the impact on their life? Well, people with social anxiety disorders are less likely to do well in school, less likely to do well in their careers, less likely to do well in their relationships and in their families in a variety of ways listed here. Social anxiety disorder also has an earlier onset than other anxiety disorders, typically by age of 13, the vast majority by adolescence. And without treatment, social anxiety tends to be a lifelong problem. Whereas most other disorders tend to recover within 10 years, even without treatment. Social anxiety disorder for 2/3 of the people is lifelong without treatment. But the good news is that treatments for social anxiety disorder through CBT are 2/3 to 3/4 effective. 2/3 to 3/4 of people experiencing specialized CBT for social anxiety disorder recover. A question arises of why is social anxiety disorder usually lifelong? This is really important for the topic of today's session. You would think that social anxiety would ultimately habituate through exposure. As avoidant as people are, there's no way to avoid all interactions, or it's virtually impossible anyways. And so people with social anxiety disorder probably have some daily, at least a few times a week, but probably daily, often multiple times a day, of exposure of interacting. But that exposure is not leading to habituation. Why? Well, for one thing, the thing that we're afraid of with social anxiety disorder is invisible for the most part, judgment. Usually judgment is kept to ourselves, at least among adults. Occasionally it's voiced, but not usually. And so even if an interaction goes well, people with social anxiety disorder will often tell themselves, well, they were just being nice. They didn't share their judgment. And so they walk away feeling like they were still judged, even though there's no overt evidence of it. Also, social anxiety disorder involves a great deal of internalized focus on their feelings and thoughts. And we're going to be working today on how to overcome that problem. And the problem with focusing on our feelings and thoughts is that it leads us to have a distorted view of how well our interactions are going. When we feel anxious and we're having thoughts that, oh, I screwed up, I didn't say that well, this person isn't interested in me, this is going badly, then those feelings and thoughts make it seem like the actual interaction is going badly. We're relying on that internal phony evidence of how we feel and think, which is very different than the actual external evidence of how something is going. And there have been a number of studies showing that the interactions in which socially anxious people judge themselves as doing very poorly tend to be judged much more positively by others. In addition, before and after people are experiencing a social anxiety trigger, there's much rumination, worry, thinking in a negative way about the interaction that's about to come up or the interaction that occurred in the past. And we tend to ruminate about the negative aspects of the interaction or what we fear will happen, so that even though the interaction may have been largely a positive one, after an hour of ruminating about it, and the rumination could go on for days and honestly years, after much time of ruminating about it, it feels to the person with social anxiety like it was a horrible, humiliating experience, even though, again, externally, it went rather well. Finally, there's a heavy reliance in social anxiety disorder on a wide variety of safety-seeking behaviors, some of which involve overt avoidance or covert avoidance, some of which are very subtle, and we'll be discussing those in a bit. And these are all reasons why social anxiety does not usually habituate on its own. But the last point is, remember, social anxiety is not just about anxiety, it's also about shame. Anxiety may habituate under the right circumstances, as long as we're not using safety-seeking behaviors, but there's no evidence that shame habituates. Exposure therapy for shame does not lead to the habituation of shame. You need to do cognitive work in addition to behavioral exposure work to reduce shame. There's a lot of research on social anxiety. Most relevant for this workshop in the first paragraph is that cognitive behavioral therapy for social anxiety is more effective than anything else. More effective than either other kinds of behavioral therapy, such as exposure therapy, which is really significant because with other anxiety disorders, typically exposure therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, which is both exposure therapy plus cognitive work, are more or less equally effective in other anxiety disorders, but not with social anxiety disorder. CBT, using the Clark model, which we'll be discussing, is more effective than exposure therapy alone, more effective than social skill training, more effective than acceptance and commitment therapy, more effective than any of the medications, which is really important. Although there are a number of medications that are very useful with social anxiety disorder, as well as other anxiety disorders, CBT tends to be more effective than these medications. And it's certainly more effective than psychodynamic therapy, relaxation therapy, supportive therapy, and so forth. There's more research on other subjects related to social anxiety that you can access through the National Social Anxiety Center website. As I said earlier, one of the key problems with social anxiety disorder, with all anxiety disorders, are the use of what are usually called safety behaviors. I prefer to call them safety-seeking behaviors, just to highlight to clients that actually they don't bring safety. It's just that we're seeking safety out through the use of them. And it's the reliance on these safety-seeking behaviors that hold back our progress. They fall into two broad categories in my way of looking at things. One is self-monitoring, and most therapists have tended to neglect that kind of thing as a behavior, but it's crucial. We tend to look at overt behaviors like what we do and what we say. Self-monitoring is what we're paying attention to. But that's really important. With social anxiety, we are usually internally focused, not because they're narcissistic, which it used to be believed, but that's false. But we're focused on our anxiety symptoms because we're trying to tamp them down. We're afraid that they're going to show and lead to embarrassment and humiliation and judgment and criticism. We're self-critiquing in our minds our performance, how well we're speaking, how well we're appearing while we're interacting with people. We're often scripting in our minds what to say next, as well as critiquing what we just said. We're scrutinizing the other person, seeking possible signs of their negative reactions to us in a way that's externally focused, but it's still about trying to figure out how are they thinking about us. So in a way, it's really internally focused. It's a form of self-monitoring. And as I said earlier, before and after the interactions, there's much rumination, much worry about how things will go or have gone. And these are important safety-seeking behaviors that we need to eliminate, or at least greatly reduce. Then there's all sorts of forms of avoidance, some of which are overt, such as not going to activities, or if you're at the activity, not speaking up, not expressing yourself, not initiating conversation, not joining conversations, not speaking about yourself, not telling stories. And then there's all sorts of other more covert forms of avoidant behaviors, such as trying to hide our anxiety symptoms so that people don't see us blush or hands jitter. We hold tightly to a glass of water or put our hands in our pocket because we're afraid they're going to jitter. We speak very little or softly because we're afraid of how we're going to sound. We ask lots of questions in order to keep attention off ourselves, or we use things like alcohol or prescribed medications as safety-seeking behaviors to try to hide our symptoms. When working with clients, the way I like to explain safety-seeking behaviors initially is using the analogy of an actor on stage. And although many people may never have acted in their lives, although I suppose most people did at some point in school, it's been my experience that people can really identify with this. The analogy goes, imagine an actor on stage who has stage fright, who is very concerned about how will the audience view her performance and how will the professional critics in the audience write up her performance the following day. Stage fright is a type of performance anxiety. It is a type of social anxiety. And imagine that in order to deal and respond to her stage fright and her fears that she won't perform well, the actor monitors her performance while she's performing. She's thinking about, how did I say that line? I didn't say it as well as I should have. My mannerisms weren't as expressive as I had wanted them to be. My staging wasn't exactly as we had rehearsed. And the audience isn't laughing or is laughing when they're not supposed to be. And imagine the actor is doing all of that in her mind, evaluating how she's performing while she is on stage performing. And then I ask the client, what do you think the impact of that self-monitoring, that self-evaluation is? And I haven't met a client yet who hasn't said something like, well, it's going to mess up her performance and make her more anxious. And I ask why. I said, well, it's distracting her from being fully engaged in the performance. And it's making her think about uncomfortable things, both of which are going to hurt her performance and make her feel more uncomfortable, more anxious. And then I explain that that's what we do when we're experiencing social anxiety. We are evaluating our performance, quote unquote performance, even if it's a social conversation, we're thinking of it as a performance and we're evaluating how well are we speaking, was it interesting, how is this person responding, how am I appearing, do I look anxious, do I act anxious, and we're doing all of that while we're having a conversation. All of that makes us more anxious because those are troubling thoughts to have, scary thoughts. But it also distracts us, and that distraction hurts our performance because we're not fully mentally in the conversation. Even when we're scripting what to say next, ironically, scripting makes it harder to have things to say. Why? Because while we're scripting, we're not fully listening, which blocks our brain from doing the thing that's most useful in a conversation, which is free associating. In other words, by listening closely, things will pop into your mind naturally that you can say, and that's what helps a conversation flow. But when we're scripting what to say next, that blocks our brain from free associating. And so if we do come up with things to say, it comes across as forced, unnatural, not flowing. Plus, it's a lot of work. Relying on safety-seeking behaviors also prevents us from learning, because even when things go well during an interaction, we walk away feeling confident, not in ourselves, but confident in the safety-seeking behaviors. The opposite of social anxiety essentially is self-confidence, but we're not building self-confidence when we're relying on safety-seeking behaviors. The confidence is in the crutch that we're using, that we're leaning on. I like to describe safety-seeking behaviors as a false friend, as an enemy in the disguise of a friend. A friend, because in the very short run, safety-seeking behaviors do tend to make it easier on us. They lessen our anxiety. Perhaps they avoid the anxiety entirely if we avoid the interaction. But a false friend, because the safety-seeking behavior actually increases our belief in the negative thoughts and core beliefs that make us anxious in the first place. I also like to explain that avoidance is not neutral. Most clients, maybe most people, think that by not taking action, we're just sort of standing still. It's neutral. Actually not. Avoidance due to anxiety is not standing still. It's taking a step backwards. Because when we avoid something due to our anxious hot thoughts and underlying core beliefs, we are increasing our belief in those anxious hot thoughts and underlying core beliefs, which makes it more likely for us to feel anxious, maybe even more so the next time. As I said earlier, safety-seeking behaviors are crutches that we lean on too much. And when we let go of those crutches, at first we're wobbly because we don't have that support, but then we start building confidence as we're learning that, hey, I can handle this situation and it goes a lot better than I had thought. Lastly, I like to emphasize with clients that the reliance on safety-seeking behaviors is the major obstacle to our making progress, which is actually good news because we can change our behaviors. It's not about changing ourselves, it's about changing our behaviors as well as our thinking. Now, it's one thing explaining safety-seeking behaviors. It's more important to help clients discover how safety-seeking behaviors has affected their lives. And so I will be taking you through an exercise over the next several slides of the way David Clark at Oxford instructs therapists in CBT to introduce through discovery, through experiment that happens in session, how to help clients discover the impact of relying on self-monitoring and other safety-seeking behaviors. This workshop is too short for me to actually demonstrate these techniques, so I will discuss them and in the next several slides give you instructions on how to use it. But this slide has links to short videos of demonstrations that David Clark's clinic has of how to actually carry out these exercises, as well as a couple articles. So if you want to see demonstrations, which I strongly recommend, go to some of these links. So the first experiment you do with somebody with social anxiety, at least when you're working on their social anxiety, and typically this happens in the very first session after assessment, and is something that I call the self-monitoring experiment. He calls it the self-focus and safety-seeking behavior experiment. It's an experiment aimed at helping clients discover how their self-monitoring impacts their performance in conversation and how well they feel and appear. I don't let clients know in advance this is going to happen because otherwise they would likely ruminate, worry a great deal about it. I pick an experiment that is likely to be an anxiety trigger for clients. Depending on the client, For the vast majority, it's usually a conversation with a stranger. I don't usually have the ability to bring somebody else into the office, which is what he suggests, you know, such as a receptionist or something. I do work with one other clinician, but that person is usually in session when I'm in session. So I usually do it with myself, which is why it's important that it happen ideally in the first session before the client is very comfortable with me. They're typically socially anxious with the therapist in the early sessions. So the sooner you do this experiment, the more likely you are to help the client experience what it's like to interact with a stranger with whom you're anxious while focusing on yourself versus when you're focused externally. So do this experiment very early. I first ask the client to identify what is it they're afraid will happen if they have a conversation with a stranger, or if they prefer to work on public speaking, if instead the experiment is to stand up and to give an informal presentation about something like their last vacation or their growing up in their family history or what have you. And we ask what are their feared outcomes, and we write these down. The feared outcome might be that I will appear anxious, that I will blush, that I will say something stupid, that people will laugh at me. And we give each of these a rating from 0 to 100 to indicate how strong a problem they think this will be, where 100 is a very intense problem. We also help the client identify what are the safety-seeking behaviors that you engage in. In other words, what is it that you do, or in some cases avoid doing, in order to prevent your feared outcome from occurring. And so they might say, well, in order to avoid my hand shaking, I keep my hands in my pocket, or I hold on to this glass or my pencil real tightly, or in order to hide my blushing, I look downward, or I put if I have long hair, I let my hair drape over my cheeks. I might wear a shirt that goes up above my neck in order to hide blushing in my neck. It might be that I'm scripting what do I say next right before I say it. So we help them identify what their safety-seeking behaviors are. And in the first experiment, we ask the client to monitor how you are coming across during the conversation and to use the 1 or 2 most important safety-seeking behaviors that the client identified. So that's the key thing. In the first conversation, or if they're doing public speaking, the first time of doing that, we tell the client it's really important, do what you usually do. Monitor how you are coming across and use 1 or 2 of the other safety-seeking behaviors that you identified. And we would have that conversation for about 5 minutes. Ideally, you would, of course, with the client's permission, video record it, because the latter part of this experiment is then to review the video recording as evidence, which we'll be discussing in a bit. After the conversation, which would last about 5 minutes, usually we pick a topic that's easy for the client to talk about, usually asking the client what is a topic that's easy for you to talk about. After the conversation, we have the stranger go away, and if it is a stranger, have them rate how they feel the client came across. And then one-on-one with the client, we ask the client to review each of their feared outcomes and how they feel it went. So if their feared outcome is that they would blush, we ask them, how much do you feel that you blushed? Again, using a scale 0 to 100. If their feared outcome is that they would say stupid things, or that they would come across awkwardly, or that the other person would laugh at them or look strangely at them, we would ask them to identify how much they feel that came across. And we also ask them to identify how much was your focus on yourself, on monitoring yourself and how you were coming across and what to say next, versus how much were you externally focused, and how much were you focused on your safety-seeking behaviors. Again, rating this, because the goal in the first experiment is to see how things come across when they're self-focused. Then we do the second experiment. The same thing with one fundamental difference. We ask the client to get lost, get absorbed, get engrossed in the conversation, and to drop their safety-seeking behaviors. So rather than monitoring themselves and how they're coming across, get absorbed in the conversation, get lost in the conversation. And rather than focus on their safety-seeking behaviors, just really get engrossed in all that is being discussed. Now, if you're doing this with a stranger, Clark recommends that you practice it together with the client, the therapist and the client first for a few minutes, just to make sure that they're able to focus externally or that they're practicing externally. Everyone is able. But if you're doing it with yourself, as I do, you would have a second conversation with the client, either with the stranger or in this case with yourself, the therapist. Again, reminding the client right before you start, make sure that you focus just on the conversation, drop the safety behaviors, get absorbed, get engrossed, get lost in the conversation. We would pick a different topic. We do have it video recorded. At the end of that conversation, we ask for their ratings of all the feared outcomes, like we did at the end of the first conversation, giving it numeric ratings. We also asked to what extent were they internally focused, self-monitoring, in other words, versus focused just on the conversation itself. To what extent were they truly engrossed in the conversation? If it turns out they were still internally focused, we'll do the conversation again to help them practice being more externally focused, but usually there's enough of a difference. They're more externally focused, enough to create a difference for the experiment to produce useful evidence. And we also ask them, to what degree were you focused on using your safety behaviors, or were you able to drop them? Then we show the client their 3 sets of ratings. The first set is from before the 2 experiments started, how they anticipated they would appear and perform. The second rating is from after the first conversation, when they were self-monitoring and using safety-seeking behaviors. And the third set of ratings is from after the second conversation, where they were more externally focused and less reliant on their safety-seeking behaviors. And we ask a client, what can you learn from this experience? Typically what they'll say is, gee, I appeared better than I thought. Even the first time around when I was internally focused, I came across better than I thought I would, but I came across much better. The conversation went much more flowing the second time when I was more externally focused. And I ask a client, what can you learn from this? And hopefully they'll say something, generally they do, is that I rely too much on monitoring myself, and that actually, instead of helping me, hurts me. If this is toward the end of a session, which it usually is by this time, I suggest homework where they practice dropping self-monitoring and instead trying to get lost, absorbed, engrossed in the conversation or other activity whenever they're socially anxious. We'll practice this more later in this workshop, how to do this. At the next session, we review the video recordings if you made it, which I do recommend. Occasionally there's time to do it in the same session, but not usually. And so before showing the video recording, I ask the client to, but now this is a week later typically, depending on your schedule. So who knows how their memory is now of how the 2 conversational experiments or public speaking experiment went a week later versus how they experienced it right after. So we ask them at this following session to close their eyes and to remember the first conversation, the one where they were self-monitoring, and then open their eyes and describe how they believe they came across. And we write down their concerns, each of their feared outcomes. How nervous did they think they appeared? How well do they think they handled the conversation? How do they remember the other person reacting to them? And we write down each of those ratings using a scale of 0 to 100. Now this time, if one of their concerns is regarding blushing, there is a red color chart like you get at a paint store that goes from very faint pink to very deep, deep red, which I'll show you in a later slide. And we ask them to actually pick a shade of red that they think they appear. But regardless of whether or not they think they blush, we ask them to rate how they imagine they appeared, how they imagine they performed, and how they imagine the other person was reacting to them before watching the video. Then, right before watching the video, and this part is really important, and when I first started doing this, I didn't do this enough, and it really messes up the experiment. So it's really important to give them directions as to how to watch the video. If you don't, most people, even people without social anxiety disorder, feel socially anxious, unless they're narcissistic, watching a video of themselves, or sometimes even listening to an audio recording of themselves, because we tend to think, oh, I look terrible, I sound terrible, etc. So right before the client watches the video of the first conversation, we instruct them to pay attention just to what they see and hear, just to what goes into their eyes and their ears, and to ignore what they think and feel for the 5 minutes or so of the video. Just notice what you see in the video, what you hear in the video, and not just about yourself, but about the other person too. Don't just pay attention to yourself. Don't just pay attention to your hands or your cheeks. Don't just pay attention to what you're saying. Pay attention to everything you see in the video, you and the other person, and just what you see and hear, not what you think and feel. Also, we use third person to describe the client at that point so that we can create a sense of distance. So instead of saying, pay attention to yourself, pay attention to what Larry is saying and thinking, but also to what Sally is saying and thinking. So we use third person to help create a sense of distance. And finally, I say, imagine that you're watching this video on TV of a stranger, not yourself, that these are strangers on a video, again, to help create a sense of distance so that hopefully they're viewing the video more objectively. After watching the video the first time, it's the video of the first conversation, that is, we again ask the client to rate this time how they feel they came across, how they feel they appeared, how they feel they did in the conversation, and how they feel the other person reacted to them. And if one of their concerns was blushing, we also ask them to pick the color of the shade of pink or red that they believe they came across in the video. And we compare those ratings, as well as the shade of red, we compare those ratings to the way they anticipated feeling. And we ask them what they can learn from that. And again, usually what they'll say is, gee, I came across better than I thought I did. I appeared less anxious than I thought I did. I blushed much less dramatically. I was much more of a light shade of pink than deep beet red. The other person seemed to be reacting to me like they were genuinely interested, where I thought I was coming across poorly. Then we go through these same procedures for the second video. First, asking the client what they anticipate their ratings would be. First asking the client how they anticipate they will come across in the second video, by having them remember that experience in their minds first, writing down those ratings, watching the video again, instructing the client to watch it mindfully, to pay attention, in other words, just to what they see and hear, and ignore what they think and feel. I realize I'm on the wrong slide now. And then seek out their feedback after the video of how they came across, write down those ratings, use the color chart again. And then we compare all three sets of ratings and ask them what they can learn. And typically what they're learning is things like the following. I come across better when I'm focused externally on the conversation itself than when I'm focused on self-monitoring and relying on my safety behaviors. They already learned that before in the previous session, but they learn it again by seeing themselves in the video. But the other new thing they learn with the video is that they come across better even in the first conversation, and certainly in the second one, than they anticipated they did. That they appear less anxious, they blush less, they sound less nervous, their conversation is going better, and the other person is reacting to them more positively as seen objectively in the video than they thought they came across. Now that's usually the case. This slide, though, shows that sometimes clients, after watching the videos, are very, very critical of how they came across. It's as though they're watching a different video than what you saw. They see very different things. And even with the instructions you're giving the client in advance of how to watch the video, you know, a significant minority of clients still manage to watch the video in a highly self-critical lens that helps them see something much more negative than actually occurred in the video. And there's a number of suggestions in this slide of how to correct for that. It might mean watching it again after asking the client, how externally focused were you just on what you saw and heard when you were watching the video? And if they weren't overwhelmingly focused on that and they were focused on their thoughts and feelings, we instruct them to try watching the video again together with us where they're more focused just on what they see and hear. It might be helpful for them to imagine that the video is a video of a friend of theirs rather than a video of a stranger, a video of themselves. That might help them view it with greater objectivity, maybe even compassion. We might stop the video every minute or so and ask the client, pause the video and ask the client, how externally focused are you just on what you see and hear versus internally on what you think and feel, to help them again get more externally focused. It might be useful to have them focus just on what they see and turn off the audio, or vice versa, just on what they hear and have the audio on, but cover the picture just for a minute or so to help them get better external focus, and then go back to watching and listening to both the audio and the picture. It might be helpful if you have someone else working in your clinic to ask the client, can you bring someone else in and ask them to watch the video and have them rate what they see. And finally, if after all of that, the client is still self-critical of certain points, we would review those segments of the video in which the client was self-critical. And sometimes the client is right. They might be saying, well, you know what, I was fidgeting with my hands, or I was looking at the floor a lot, or I was saying a lot. And so if that's the case, if the client is actually objectively describing a self-defeating behavior, we suggest that that's a safety-seeking behavior, a crutch that they're used to relying on. And that's one of the things that we'll work on together in CBT. One thing I forgot to mention earlier is if you did get ratings from the stranger, if you used a different person, you can get them to give ratings on paper of how the client came across. When we're reviewing the video, we would also review the ratings from the stranger afterwards so that the client is getting feedback from both the evidence in the video itself and feedback from the evidence that was written down by the stranger. So all this was to help a client discover the impact of self-monitoring. And there's a number of handouts that I have available for you, a couple of which are in these slides, but all of which are in the handouts. This is a form that I use with video that has the before and after ratings. This is that color chart I talked about. And here's where I talk now about with a client after they've discovered the impact of self-monitoring, that the alternative is external mindfulness. Now I need to stress that we're talking about external mindfulness. Usually when therapists, or most people in general, are talking about mindfulness, we're talking about meditation. Meditation is internal mindfulness. And although meditation is really useful for many things, Many outcome studies have shown that meditation is not very useful to help clients overcome social anxiety disorder. In fact, a number of studies show that a placebo is more effective than meditation for social anxiety disorder. Again, for many other things, meditation is useful. But external mindfulness is really key. Mindfulness isn't meditation. Mindfulness is paying attention to something in the present moment with an attitude of curiosity rather than judgment. It's not necessarily paying attention to your breath or a mantra or to an image like you would in meditation. Hand in hand with mindfulness is thought diffusion. So while we're paying attention to something in the present moment with curiosity rather than judgment, we're also diffusing from our thoughts and feelings too. It's really thought and feeling diffusion. And by diffusion, it means being aware of our thoughts and feelings, but we're not getting involved with them. What's meant by external mindfulness, specifically for social anxiety, is that we're paying attention with curiosity, taking interest in the conversation, the persons we're interacting with, the activity or the situation we're in the present moment. What we see, what we hear, maybe taste, smell, and touch as well. We're getting lost and absorbed in the conversation, the experience, the person, rather than paying attention to what we think and feel. In fact, we're treating what we think and feel like background noise, trying to get out of our heads and into the moment. And again, I use the analogy of an actor on stage, that what we want that actor to do is to just get lost in the performance and to not evaluate her performance until after the performance is completely over. I also use an analogy of imagine having a friend on your right and a different friend on your left, having two different conversations at the same time with you. We can't do that. We would go back and forth and lose it. And that's what we want to do, is we want to ignore the conversation going on in our head, all that self-criticism, and instead just focus on the conversation, the activity going on in front of us. Another analogy is imagine having a friend over to an outdoor cafe in normal times and having a meal with that person. There's all sorts of noise around us, other conversations, other noise from the restaurant and from traffic. And what we're trying to do is to treat all that noise as just background noise and to keep returning our attention back to the conversation whenever we get distracted by the noise. That's what we want to do with our thoughts and feelings. As I said, external mindfulness is very effective for social anxiety. Internal mindfulness is useful for some things, so I sometimes introduce it, but it's never the first strategy. External mindfulness is. I describe this as curiosity training. The first way I introduce this is listen to me closely as I play this recording of Hot Thoughts. So I'm having a conversation with the client.
What do I say next?
While there's a recording.
I'm coming across as so uninteresting, so boring as usual.
And I help the client.
I got to get out of this conversation, or I'm just going to feel so stupid again. What's he thinking of me? How did I get into this? I really got to find a way to leave.
To distract.
I'm so nervous. Why am I so nervous? Other people aren't so nervous. What's the matter with me? He could probably... I don't know.
As you can see, this is difficult. In a real life session, we might do it for 5 minutes. Every minute, I might stop the conversation, ask the client how they're doing, and encourage them to be more and more externally focused just on the conversation. And this is meant as an introduction to help the client get more externally focused. Then as homework, I introduce a number of ideas. There's a series of videos that are aimed at helping a client focus more externally on what they see and hear, that are created by the David Clark team and are linked on YouTube here. You can also use a music video where there's all sorts of things going on. You know, there's singers, there's musicians, there's actors, there's scenery. The one I like to use is a song from the musical Dear Evan Hansen, which is a musical about a boy with social anxiety disorder. And this is a song about his experience in high school with social anxiety disorder. And it's great because it usually triggers anxiety for a socially anxious person to view. And they're watching these videos, whether it's from the music or the David Clark videos, with the goal of practicing paying attention just to what they see and hear. When they're tired of doing the recordings, they can go out into a location where there's people and sights and sounds and just sort of practice people watching and observing the things around them, the sounds around them, paying attention one at a time. And to practice all of these and to record these in a log, which I'll show you. Now, all of that was practicing curiosity while observing, but it's also important to practice curiosity while participating. And that's what this slide is about, is to practice for at least 5 minutes every day, being mindfully focused, externally focused on the conversation every day, maybe using the dial-up app where they can have a conversation with a stranger every day if they want, or maybe they have other people that they can talk to as well, and to practice this every day. And there's some other details here of how to make it go better. This is a handout I give to client that describes all of this homework practice, which we might do for a few weeks. And this is a log where clients can rate how well they're doing in practicing external mindfulness, curiosity training, both while observing and participating. I want to emphasize that external mindfulness, although it's a crucial strategy within CBT, is not a standalone strategy. It's used together with cognitive restructuring, with the use of asserting oneself, with the use of core belief change work to get at those beliefs that create shame. And they're all used together in the context of behavioral experiments to help people overcome their social anxiety. And the links below have video trainings of how these other strategies are used together with external mindfulness. There's a couple worksheets that I'm showing here that are also in the handouts along with others that are used in helping people do experiments that trigger their social anxiety, in which they're practicing external mindfulness during those experiments, as well as experiments to challenge their unhealthy core beliefs that create shame and anxiety. The last thing I want to mention is that external mindfulness is used later in CBT for social anxiety to help clients see the difference between how things are now versus how things were when they were younger and first developing social anxiety. This slide shows how to use a really intriguing strategy called then versus now. He calls it stimulus discrimination training, in which we're helping a client identify what their image of themselves is, of how they come across and how others are reacting to them when they're socially anxious, how they learned that image when they were a kid or an adolescent, maybe a young adult, but usually earlier, and how things are different now versus then. And so there's imagery exercises you do in session to help them identify those images, to help them identify how things are different now versus then, and homework to suggest how they could then practice identifying how things are different now versus how things are different in their image. By focusing mindfully externally, they could see those differences. And lastly, these are questionnaires used to help measure social anxiety before treatment, halfway through, and at the end of treatment, and shorter questionnaires to use every week to measure progress. Thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have.